Nobody was accused. Nobody was sanctioned. Nobody even had their flag mentioned. And yet, according to U.S. officials, roughly $6 billion worth of restricted American technology found its way into Russia after export controls were put in place. That's an extraordinary number. What's even stranger is the silence surrounding one obvious question. Where did it all pass through? Trade data doesn't disappear. Containers don't teleport. High-end electronics don't accidentally wander across continents. Somewhere between American factories and Russian buyers, someone kept the supply chain alive. Washington acknowledged the problem in unusually direct language. But when it came to naming one of the friendliest countries involved, the language suddenly became careful. That contrast matters more than the $6 billion because this story isn't really about smuggling. It's about diplomacy colliding with economics. It's about what happens when a strategic partner becomes commercially indispensable at exactly the wrong moment. And once governments have to choose between enforcing policy and protecting alliances, the public statements often become much quieter than the internal conversations. We'll come back to one particular number later, 45%. It doesn't look remarkable at first glance. By the time we're finished, it'll explain why this issue became so politically delicate. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and several other allies introduced some of the broadest technology export controls ever assembled. The objective sounded straightforward enough: deny Russia access to advanced semiconductors, telecommunications equipment, industrial machinery, precision tools, and dual-use electronics that could strengthen its military or defense industry. On paper, it was an impressive coalition. Reality had other ideas. Within months, customs records and independent trade researchers started noticing something peculiar. Russian imports from sanctioning countries had collapsed, exactly as expected. But imports from several third countries suddenly surged, often involving products that looked remarkably similar to the ones that had supposedly disappeared. Trade routes didn't end, they simply bent. Imagine closing the main highway between two cities. Traffic doesn't vanish. Drivers start looking for side roads. International commerce behaves much the same way, except those detours can involve thousands of companies, multiple customs jurisdictions, and products crossing several borders before reaching their final destination. That's where re-exporting enters the picture. Re-exporting isn't automatically illegal. A company may legally import goods into one country and later export them elsewhere. Global trade depends on that system every single day. Ports like Singapore, Dubai, and Rotterdam have built entire business models around acting as distribution hubs. The complication begins when products covered by export restrictions continue reaching destinations they were specifically meant to avoid. American officials gradually acknowledged this challenge through Treasury Department statements, Commerce Department enforcement actions, and congressional hearings. Reports from organizations tracking wartime supply chains also found that Russia continued acquiring Western-origin electronics through intermediary markets, despite the sanctions regime. Here's the uncomfortable part. Many of those intermediary economies weren't hostile to Washington. Some were long-standing security partners. Others hosted American military facilities, signed defense agreements, or maintained deep financial ties with the United States. That creates a policy dilemma that rarely makes headlines. How hard do you pressure a friendly government whose cooperation you need in dozens of other areas? It's much easier to sanction an adversary than to publicly embarrass an ally. One dry observation deserves mentioning here. Governments often insist geopolitics is guided by principles. Trade statistics occasionally submit a request for clarification. To be fair, there is another side to this argument. Officials in several countries accused of becoming transit hubs have repeatedly argued that they don't support sanctions evasion, that thousands of private firms conduct legitimate business every day, and that monitoring every shipment is extraordinarily difficult. That's not an unreasonable defense. Modern supply chains involve millions of transactions, and even well-funded customs agencies cannot inspect every container or verify every ultimate end user. But that explanation only answers part of the question, because if these flows were merely isolated mistakes, Washington wouldn't have spent the past 2 years creating specialized task forces, issuing repeated compliance warnings to banks and exporters, and privately urging partner governments to tighten enforcement. Something larger was unfolding beneath the official language. And that brings us back to the country whose name was often missing from public headlines, not because the trade wasn't happening, but because saying it aloud carried consequences extending far beyond semiconductors. The missing name, in many ways, became the most revealing fact of all. Remember that 45% from the opening? This is where it starts to matter. It comes from a pattern that trade economists pay close attention to. When a country's imports of restricted technology suddenly explode, while another sanctioned country's imports from that same market rise almost in parallel, analysts don't immediately assume wrongdoing. They ask a simpler question: who suddenly became the middleman? That question led researchers toward a handful of countries whose trade profiles changed dramatically after 2022. One of the most discussed examples was Turkey. The relationship itself made the situation unusually awkward. Turkey is a NATO member. It hosts critical military infrastructure for the alliance, controls access to the Black Sea through the Bosporus and Dardanelles under the Montreux Convention, and remains strategically important for Washington across the Middle East, Europe, and the Caucasus. At the same time, Ankara chose a different sanctions policy from most Western governments. Turkey condemned Russia's invasion and supplied Ukraine with Bayraktar TB2 drones early in the war, but it never joined the Western sanctions regime against Moscow. Instead, it attempted to maintain economic ties with both sides, arguing that preserving communication channels also served diplomatic purposes. From Ankara's perspective, this wasn't contradiction, it was balance. That balancing act created commercial opportunities almost overnight. According to trade data analyzed by institutions including the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, exports of certain high-priority goods from Western economies to several intermediary countries increased sharply after sanctions took effect. Many of those same categories, electronics, integrated circuits, machine tools, telecommunications components, and industrial equipment, also appeared in growing volumes heading toward Russia. Notice the wording. Not every shipment violated sanctions. Not every exporter knew the final destination. But patterns started repeating too consistently to dismiss as coincidence. The U.S. Department of Commerce eventually identified dozens of so-called high-priority items, products considered especially valuable for Russia's defense industrial base. These included advanced semiconductors, field programmable gate arrays, oscilloscopes, navigation equipment, precision bearings, and specialized manufacturing tools. None of these products sound dramatic, until you remember what they actually do. Modern cruise missiles don't work without sophisticated chips. Military radios depend on advanced communications components. Precision-guided weapons require sensors manufactured through remarkably global supply chains. A seemingly ordinary microcontroller can become part of a civilian washing machine or part of military hardware. Technology rarely announces its final destination. That's why export controls became so complicated. One company sells to a distributor. The distributor sells to another wholesaler. Another logistics company handles regional shipping. By the time investigators trace the supply chain, the product may have crossed 4 borders and changed ownership half a dozen times. Intent becomes difficult to prove. Responsibility becomes even harder. This explains why Washington increasingly targeted individual companies instead of entire governments. Throughout 2023 and 2024, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control and the Bureau of Industry and Security imposed restrictions on businesses in multiple countries accused of helping Russia obtain restricted technology. That's an important distinction. Sanctioning a company sends a message. Accusing an allied government sends a different one. Diplomats understand that difference instinctively. There's another layer people often overlook. Many intermediary countries didn't suddenly build enormous electronics industries. They became trade platforms. Goods arrived from Europe, the United States, Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan were legally imported, and then, in some cases, left again through entirely separate commercial channels. The paperwork could look perfectly ordinary until someone compared thousands of transactions over months rather than examining one shipment in isolation. Patterns reveal what individual invoices often hide. Here's where the story becomes genuinely difficult. Suppose you're Washington. You need allied unity against Russia. You also need cooperation on intelligence sharing, counterterrorism, energy security, migration, and regional stability. Publicly naming a friendly country as the weak link in your sanctions architecture might satisfy domestic critics, but it could also damage relationships that matter far beyond export controls. That's not a comfortable trade-off. It's a strategic one. A dry observation fits here. Diplomacy has an interesting habit of replacing proper nouns with carefully constructed sentences. Still, pressure quietly increased. Senior American officials visited partner governments. Financial institutions received compliance warnings. Exporters faced stricter due diligence requirements. Customs authorities exchanged intelligence more aggressively than before. Most of those conversations happened behind closed doors. Public statements remained noticeably restrained. And yet, despite those efforts, investigators kept discovering Western-made components inside captured Russian military equipment months later. Which raises a harder question than whether sanctions worked. What if the real weakness wasn't enforcement at the border, but the design of globalization itself? Because once advanced supply chains span dozens of countries and thousands of private firms, controlling technology becomes far more complicated than controlling territory. And that's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Everyone likes to imagine sanctions as a switch. Flip it off, and the flow stops. Global trade doesn't work that way. It's closer to a river. Block one channel, and the water starts searching for another. The surprising part isn't that alternative routes appeared. The surprising part is how quickly markets adapted. Take semiconductors. A modern chip might be designed in California, manufactured in Taiwan using Dutch lithography machines, tested in Malaysia, packaged in Vietnam, shipped to a distributor in Europe, sold to a trading company in another country, and only then purchased by its final customer. Every step may be perfectly legal on its own, yet the complete journey can produce an outcome that none of the original participants intended. That complexity became Russia's biggest opportunity. But here's the reversal. The biggest problem wasn't necessarily countries trying to help Russia. It was that globalization had become too efficient. For decades, the United States encouraged integrated supply chains because they lowered costs, increased production, and connected allies through trade. Companies optimized every link for speed and profit, not for geopolitical resilience. Then war arrived, and governments suddenly expected those same networks to behave like security systems. They were never built for that. This is where that 45% figure returns. Researchers studying trade flows noticed that in some categories of high-priority goods, a substantial share of exports from intermediary countries to Russia consisted of products that those countries had themselves imported only shortly beforehand. In other words, these economies often weren't manufacturing the technology. They were functioning as transit points. The value wasn't in producing the equipment, it was in moving it. That changes how you think about responsibility. Imagine blaming an airport because passengers changed planes there. If airport management knowingly facilitates illegal travel, that's one issue. If millions of legitimate travelers pass through the same terminals every year, distinguishing the suspicious ones becomes a completely different challenge. International trade faces the same dilemma. This is also where critics of the sanctions strategy make their strongest argument. They point out that Russia's economy did not collapse as many early forecasts suggested. Industrial production recovered in several sectors. Defense manufacturing accelerated. Imports of critical electronics, while more expensive and slower to obtain, never disappeared completely. Those are real observations. Ignoring them would weaken the analysis. But the opposite claim, that sanctions failed entirely, isn't supported either. Russia has paid a significant price. Access to cutting-edge Western technology became more limited. Logistics costs increased. Parallel import networks demanded additional intermediaries, higher insurance premiums, and more complicated financing. Russian manufacturers frequently substituted components, delayed production schedules, or relied on less advanced alternatives. The pipeline kept flowing. It just became narrower, slower, and far more expensive. That's a meaningful difference. Think about a factory waiting for one specialized chip worth $50. Without it, a machine costing millions can't leave the assembly line. Modern manufacturing often depends on surprisingly small components. One missing circuit board can idle an entire production facility. This is why the United States gradually shifted its strategy. Rather than assuming sanctions alone would solve the problem, Washington expanded export control enforcement, coordinated investigations with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and the G7, and increased pressure on financial institutions processing suspicious transactions. Notice the evolution. The conversation moved away from punishment and toward prevention, because policymakers eventually realized something uncomfortable. You cannot police 21st century supply chains with 20th century enforcement tools. Artificial intelligence is making customs inspections more sophisticated. Digital tracking systems are improving. Governments are sharing commercial intelligence more rapidly than before. So are private trading networks. It's an endless race. Every time regulators identify one workaround, another appears somewhere else in the chain. That's not because every participant is acting in bad faith. It's because global commerce rewards efficiency, and efficiency naturally creates alternative routes. There's an irony buried in all of this. The same interconnected economy that made the world wealthier also made it much harder to isolate any major power completely. Washington understands that. Beijing certainly understands it. Moscow has spent the last 3 years proving it. Which brings us to the question that sits above this entire discussion. Not whether one friendly nation helped move restricted equipment, but whether any modern superpower can realistically control technology once it has entered a global marketplace built to keep goods moving. That answer carries consequences reaching far beyond Russia and Ukraine. If you step back from the headlines, the $6 billion figure almost becomes secondary. The real story is what Washington's response tells us about the limits of American power. For decades, the United States could usually separate economics from security. Trade agreements belonged in one room. Military alliances belonged in another. Today's world doesn't allow that luxury. A single container of advanced electronics can become both a commercial transaction and a national security issue at the same time. That's why this episode feels so different. When American officials repeatedly warned about re-export networks, but often avoided turning friendly governments into public targets, they weren't necessarily being inconsistent. They were revealing the reality of modern geopolitics. Sometimes your partner is also your biggest enforcement challenge. That doesn't make the partnership meaningless. It makes it complicated. My own view is this. Sanctions should never be judged by one question. Did they completely stop the flow? That's an impossible standard in a global economy involving millions of companies and billions of daily transactions. The better question is whether they raised costs, delayed access to critical technology, forced strategic adjustments, and reduced an opponent's long-term capacity. On those measures, the evidence points to partial success rather than total failure. But partial success comes with its own warning. If friendly countries become indispensable transit hubs, Washington will increasingly rely on quiet diplomacy instead of public confrontation. That may preserve alliances, but it also creates the perception that rules are enforced differently depending on who is involved. And perceptions matter. They influence financial markets, investor confidence, diplomatic credibility, and even how smaller countries decide which side to trust. There's another question I can't quite shake. If the United States, with its intelligence agencies, financial influence, customs databases, and global alliance network, still struggles to fully control the movement of restricted technology. What happens when artificial intelligence makes international trade even faster, more decentralized, and harder to trace? I'm not completely certain where that ends, but the data leans in one direction. The next generation of export controls won't be decided at border crossings. They'll be decided through software, financial networks, digital supply chain verification, AI-assisted customs inspections, and real-time tracking of sensitive components long before they ever reach a shipping port. The competition is already shifting. Countries know it. Companies know it. The logistics industry definitely knows it. And here's my prediction. Within the next 5 years, we'll hear much less about blanket sanctions and much more about targeted technology ecosystems. Governments will try to monitor not just where products go, but who designed them, who financed them, who insured them, who updated their software, and who supplied each critical component. Control will move upstream. That won't eliminate re-exporting. It will simply make the game more sophisticated. Remember the silence we started with? The unnamed country wasn't the most important part of this story after all. The silence itself was. Because when governments carefully avoid saying a partner's name, they're quietly admitting that geopolitics is rarely divided into friends and rivals. More often, it's divided into relationships that are too valuable to break, even when they're deeply inconvenient. And perhaps that's the lasting lesson here. Globalization wasn't designed for an era of economic warfare. Yet that's exactly the era we've entered. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and let me know what topic you'd like me to unpack next. The biggest stories are often the ones hiding in plain sight, sometimes behind a trade report, and sometimes behind a name that never gets mentioned.